My parents always said they only had enough love for one daughter. And they meant it literally so literally that my sister and I spent 15 years taking turns being their child, while the other one lived in the basement pretending she didn't exist. I need to explain how this worked because it sounds impossible until you understand. My sister Scarlett was born 11 months after me. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same small frame, we looked nearly identical. And my parents looked at two babies and decided the universe had made a mistake they needed to correct. So they created a system. On the first of every month, one of us became Sophie, their daughter, the one who went to school, slept in a bedroom, existed. The other one moved to the basement with a sleeping bag and disappeared. We shared one life, one school record, one medical file, one name. The outside world never knew there were two of us. So I'm going to tell you what it was like to live as half a person. How Scarlett would sneak down to the basement after our parents fell asleep and whisper to me through the darkness about the life I was missing. How we kept journals documenting every lie, every switch, every moment we had to pretend to be each other. And what happened when I got sick during an off month and started vomiting blood, and my parents decided the easiest solution was to finally make their one-daughter fantasy permanent. Because when they pulled out that bottle of pills and gave us 7 days to decide which one of us deserved to live, Scarlett grabbed my hand and we started planning something they never saw coming. Scarlett's fingers wrapped around mine in the dark basement and her grip was so tight I could feel her pulse racing against my wrist. We sat there on the concrete floor with our backs against the cold wall, and I knew what she was thinking because I was thinking it too. We weren't going to choose. We weren't going to let them turn us against each other after 15 years of being forced to share one life. The bottle of pills sat upstairs in their bathroom cabinet, waiting for one of us to take them. But we had something they didn't know about. We had our journals. 15 years of documentation sat hidden in a gap behind the water heater. Every switch recorded, every lie we had to tell written down in our handwriting that proved two different people existed. For the first time since they gave us 7 days, I felt something other than fear. I felt angry. Scarlett leaned close and whispered that we needed to wait until they fell asleep, and then we'd figure out how to use everything we'd documented against them. The house went quiet around midnight. I heard Mother's bedroom door close, then Father's heavy footsteps in the hallway above us, then nothing but the hum of the old furnace. Scarlett crept to the basement stairs and listened for 5 full minutes before she came back and pulled out her phone. The light from the screen made her face look blue in the darkness. She grabbed the journals from behind the water heater, all 7 of them wrapped in plastic bags to keep them dry, and we spread them out on the floor between us. The flashlight app on her phone gave us just enough light to read by. I opened the oldest journal, the one from when we were 5 years old, and saw my handwriting next to Scarlett's, both of us trying to write the same name. Sophie. The name that belonged to both of us and neither of us. We started making a list of everything we could prove. At every time the school called home about Sophie's changing behavior. Every doctor's visit where the medical records wouldn't match up if anyone looked close enough. Every neighbor who might have noticed something strange about the girl next door who seemed like a different person every few weeks. Morning came too fast. Scarlett had to go upstairs and be Sophie again, and I had to stay down here getting sicker. But this time felt different because we had a plan forming. She took pictures of 3 journal pages with her phone before she left, hiding them in a folder she labeled as homework. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard Mother's voice asking why she looked so tired, heard Scarlett lie smoothly about staying up late studying. The basement door closed and locked from the outside like it always did during Sophie days. I lay back down on my sleeping bag and felt my stomach twist with pain. More blood came up when I coughed, darker than yesterday, and I had to use the basement bathroom to clean myself up. My hands shook while I ran water in the sink. 4 more days until their deadline. 4 days to make this work. Scarlett came back down after school and I could tell from her face that she'd found something. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos of documents she'd taken from Mother's filing cabinet. Life insurance policies. 3 of them. All in the name Sophie Mitchell, our shared identity, with Mother and Father listed as the people who would get the money. The policies were each for $200,000. $600,000 total. The dates on them made my stomach hurt worse than the blood I'd been throwing up. 3 years ago. Right when I first started getting sick during one of my basement months. When I told Scarlett something felt wrong inside me and she begged our parents to let me see a doctor. They'd said no. They'd said mistakes don't get medical care. And apparently they'd gone out and bought insurance policies instead, planning for this moment when one of us would die and they'd collect the money and still have their one perfect daughter left. I spent all of day 2 throwing up blood into the basement toilet while Scarlett sat in the school pretending to be me. My body felt weak and shaky and I couldn't stand up without the room spinning around me. But I used Scarlett's old phone, the one she'd hidden down here for emergencies, to search for information about people who had to report child abuse. Teachers had to report it, doctors had to report it, and school counselors had to report it, especially if they saw signs that something was wrong with a student. I thought about Eric Wolf, the counselor at the school who Scarlett had mentioned before. She'd told me he always looked confused during their meetings, Like he couldn't figure out why Sophie seemed like a completely different person every time he saw her. He'd been there for 8 years. 8 years of watching Sophie change personalities every month, probably writing notes about it, probably wondering what was going on. Scarlett came down that night and I showed her what I'd found. Her eyes got wide when she read about mandatory reporting laws. She asked if I thought Eric would believe her if she told him the truth. The next morning, Scarlett went to the school with a plan. She was going to talk to Eric and see if he'd noticed anything strange about Sophie over the years. She was going to test the waters carefully, see if he was someone who might actually help us instead of thinking we were crazy. I stayed in the basement feeling sicker and weaker, listening to the house creak above me, counting the hours until she came home. When the basement door finally opened that evening, Scarlett practically ran down the stairs. She sat next to me on the sleeping bag and told me everything. She'd found Eric in his office during lunch and asked if they could talk. She'd told him she needed to discuss something serious but couldn't do it at the school, and she'd asked if he'd ever noticed anything weird about her behavior over the years. His face had changed when she asked that question. He'd gotten very quiet and very focused, and he'd told her yes, he had noticed things. Personality changes, inconsistent academic performance, different handwriting on assignments. He'd been documenting his concerns for 3 years, ever since Sophie suddenly started struggling in classes she'd previously excelled in. That night, Scarlett reported that Eric wanted to schedule a meeting with Sophie and our parents, a conference to discuss Sophie's academic performance and some behavioral concerns he'd observed. Mother and father got nervous when Scarlett told them about it at dinner. I heard them through the basement ceiling, their voices tight and worried. But they didn't sound suspicious enough to refuse the meeting. They'd spent 15 years making Sophie look normal to the outside world, and they wouldn't break that pattern now, even with their murder plan counting down. Father said they'd go to the meeting and handle it like they always handled these things, with rehearsed answers about teenage mood swings and learning difficulties. Mother agreed, but her voice sounded stressed. They didn't know Eric had been watching Sophie for years. They didn't know he'd been building a file of observations that didn't make sense. They thought they were still in control. Day 3 hit me hard. I woke up barely able to move, my whole body aching and my head pounding. I heard Mother and Father fighting upstairs, their voices loud enough to carry through the floorboards. Father wanted to cancel the counselor meeting. He said it was too risky, that they should just move forward with their plan and forget about keeping up appearances. Mother shouted back that canceling would draw more attention than going. She said they'd spent 15 years making Sophie seem normal, and they couldn't break pattern now, not when they were so close to solving their problem permanently. I lay on the concrete floor listening to them argue about which one of us should die, and I felt rage burn through the sickness in my stomach. They were talking about murdering one of their daughters like it was a scheduling problem they needed to work out. Scarlett went to the meeting with our parents the next afternoon. I stayed in the basement, too weak to do anything but wait. Hours crawled by. I kept checking the old phone for the time, watching the numbers change slowly. When Scarlett finally came back down that night, she looked scared and hopeful at the same time. She told me Eric had asked careful questions about Sophie's inconsistent grades and personality changes. Our parents had their answers ready, talking about teenage development and learning disabilities, but Eric's face showed he wasn't buying it. He'd asked to speak with Sophie alone, and Mother had refused immediately. She'd stood up and said they were leaving, that this meeting was a waste of time, and Father had followed her out. Eric had watched them go with this intense look on his face, and he'd written something in his notes right there in front of them. Scarlett pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. Eric's personal cell phone number, written in his handwriting, with a note that said to call him if she ever needed help with anything at all. She'd asked him why he was giving her his number, and he'd looked at her very seriously, and said he was required by law to report suspected abuse. He'd told her he'd been documenting concerns about Sophie for 3 years now, keeping detailed notes about the inconsistencies he'd observed, and today's meeting with her parents had only made him more worried. We sat together in the basement holding that piece of paper with Eric's number on it, and for the first time since our parents gave us 7 days to choose who would die, we had something more powerful than fear. We had an ally who'd been building a case without even knowing the full truth, and we had 4 days left to tell him everything. Day 4 hit me harder than any day before. I woke up on the concrete floor with my whole body shaking and sweat soaking through my clothes even though the basement was cold. The fever made everything feel fuzzy and far away, like I was watching myself from outside my body. I threw up again, and this time there was more blood than anything else, dark red and thick, and I stared at it in the toilet feeling scared in a way I hadn't felt before. My hands were shaking when I tried to flush it, and I could barely stand up without the room spinning. I heard footsteps upstairs and knew Scarlett was getting ready for school, putting on the Sophie performance for another day, and I wanted to call out to her, but my throat felt too raw to make any sound. The basement door opened, and Scarlett came down the stairs fast, her face white when she saw me sitting on the floor next to the toilet. She knelt down and put her hand on my forehead, and I heard her breath catch. She told me I was burning up, that this was bad, really bad, and I needed to go to the hospital right now. I shook my head because I knew what our parents would say, but Scarlett grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairs. She was breaking the biggest rule we had, acknowledging my existence during her Sophie month, and I tried to tell her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. We made it halfway up the stairs before Mother appeared at the top, her face going hard when she saw both of us together. Scarlett started talking fast, saying I needed a doctor, saying the fever was too high and there was blood everywhere, and this couldn't wait 3 more days. Mother came down the stairs and I saw her hand move before I felt the slap across Scarlett's face, the sound sharp and loud in the stairwell. Mother's voice was cold when she said that mistakes don't get medical care, that we knew the rules, that Scarlett was being selfish and dramatic. Father appeared behind Mother and looked down at us with this tired expression, like we were bothering him with something small and annoying. He said in 3 days this problem would be permanently solved anyway, so there was no point wasting money on doctors. Scarlett started crying and begging, saying I might die before 3 days, and Father just turned around and walked away. Mother grabbed Scarlett by the arm and dragged her back upstairs, telling her to get ready for school and stop making scenes. I crawled back down to the basement floor and lay there shaking, listening to Scarlett crying in the kitchen above me. The morning dragged by in a blur of fever and pain. I kept drifting in and out, sometimes awake and sometimes not sure if I was dreaming. When I opened my eyes, the light coming through the small basement window had changed, and I knew it was afternoon, which meant Scarlett was at the school. I wondered if she was sitting in class pretending everything was normal, or if Eric could see something was wrong. My whole body hurt, and I couldn't stop shaking, and I started thinking maybe our parents were right. Maybe in 3 days this would all be over, and I wouldn't have to feel this sick anymore. Then I heard Scarlett's voice in my head from all those nights she'd snuck down to whisper to me in the dark, telling me we were going to survive this. We were going to get out, and I made myself sit up, even though it hurt. Scarlett came home from the school that afternoon, and I heard her footsteps running through the house. She came down to the basement and sat next to me, and her hands were shaking when she pulled out her phone. She told me she'd done it. She'd called Eric from the school bathroom during lunch, and she'd told him everything. Her voice was shaking when she described how she'd explained the whole system to him. The switching every month, the shared identity, the basement, the journals, the insurance policies, the bottle of pills, the 7-day deadline. She said Eric had stayed calm on the phone even though she was crying, and he'd told her he was calling Child Protective Services and police right away. He'd said she needed to go home and act normal until help arrived, that she shouldn't let our parents know anything had changed. But Scarlett's face was scared when she looked at me, and she said she didn't know if she could pretend everything was fine, not with me this sick, not knowing what our parents might do if they figured out she'd betrayed them. I grabbed her hand and told her she had to try. We just needed to make it through one more night and then help would come. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. When Scarlett went back upstairs, I heard Mother's voice asking where she'd been, why she was late getting home from the school. Scarlett said something about staying after to talk to a teacher about homework, and Mother's voice got sharp, asking which teacher, what homework. I heard Scarlett stumble over her words, and I knew Mother could hear the lie. Father's footsteps came into the kitchen, and everything went quiet for a minute. Then I heard Father tell Scarlett to give him her backpack. Scarlett said no, and there was a sound like something hitting the floor. Father's voice got loud, saying he asked for the backpack and he wanted it now. I heard zippers opening and things being pulled out, and then Father said something I couldn't hear clearly. Mother's voice got high and angry, asking who Eric was, why his number was in Scarlett's phone. Scarlett tried to say he was just the school counselor, but Mother started screaming about ungrateful children ruining everything, about how they'd given us one simple choice and we couldn't even do that right. I heard Father's footsteps heading toward the basement door, and I scrambled backward across the concrete floor until I hit the wall. The door flew open and Father came down the stairs fast, his face red and angry. Scarlett came running after him, screaming for him to stop, to leave me alone, and she threw herself between Father and me. Father shoved Scarlett aside and she hit the wall hard, but she got back up and grabbed his arm. He was holding the bottle of pills in his hand, and his voice was shaking when he said we'd forced his hand. We couldn't just choose like he'd asked, so he'd choose for us. Scarlett tackled him, and they both went down on the concrete floor. She was screaming at me to run, and I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't work right. I heard the pills scatter across the floor and Father cursing and Scarlett crying. I made myself move, crawling toward the stairs first and then pulling myself up using the railing. Scarlett was still fighting with Father, trying to hold him back, and I stumbled up the stairs as fast as I could. Mother was at the top and tried to grab me, but I pushed past her into the kitchen. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the phone when I grabbed it off the wall. I dialed 911 and Mother tried to rip the phone away from me. We struggled and I held on tight, screaming our address into the receiver, saying my father was trying to kill my sister in the basement. The dispatcher's voice came through calm and steady, saying police were on the way, telling me to stay on the line. Mother was pulling at my hair and the phone cord, and I kept talking, saying please hurry, please send someone now. Scarlett appeared at the top of the basement stairs with blood running down her forehead from where she'd hit the wall. She looked at me and then at Mother, and we both moved at the same time toward the bathroom. We got inside and locked the door and pushed the cabinet in front of it. Our parents started pounding on the door and Father was yelling that we were making everything worse, that we should have just chosen. Scarlett and I sat on the bathroom floor with our backs against the cabinet, holding hands, listening to our parents scream outside. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, and the dispatcher kept talking to me, asking if we were safe, telling me help was coming. 8 minutes passed that felt like hours. Then we heard sirens outside, and the pounding on the bathroom door stopped. Our parents' voices changed completely, and we heard Mother talking to someone in this sweet, concerned voice, saying she didn't understand what was happening. Their daughter Sophie had been having mental health issues and hallucinations lately. Father was agreeing, saying they'd been so worried about her, asking if the officers could help them get her some psychiatric care. I heard another voice and recognized it as Eric, and he was saying he had documentation. He needed to speak with the officers privately. More voices filled the house and someone knocked on the bathroom door gently, saying we were safe now, asking us to come out. Scarlett and I looked at each other and slowly moved the cabinet away from the door. I unlocked the bathroom door and Scarlett and I stepped out together. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, along with a woman in business clothes who introduced herself as a social worker. She asked if we were hurt, and I told her about my stomach and the blood, and Scarlett showed her the cut on her forehead. The woman's face went tight when she looked at us standing there together, 2 girls who looked almost exactly the same, and she said she needed to talk to each of us separately. They took me to the kitchen and Scarlett to the living room, and for the next hour I answered questions about the switching system, while an officer wrote everything down. I described how we'd lived for 15 years, taking turns being Sophie, sharing one life between us. I told them about the basement and the sleeping bag, and how we'd documented everything in our journals. When I mentioned the journals, the officer's eyes got sharp, and he asked where they were. I said they were hidden in the basement wall behind a loose brick, and he radioed to another officer to search for them. The social worker asked about the pills, and I told her our parents had given us 7 days to choose which one of us would die. Her hand shook when she wrote that down. She asked if I needed medical attention, and I said yes. I'd been vomiting blood for weeks, and my parents wouldn't take me to a doctor because I didn't exist during my off months. She immediately called for an ambulance. In the living room, I could hear Scarlett telling her story to a different officer, and even through the wall, I could tell she was describing the same things I was. When they brought us back together, the social worker's face looked sick. She said our stories matched exactly, down to specific dates and details about individual switches. The officers had found our journals in the basement along with my sleeping bag and the evidence of my illness on the concrete floor. One officer came upstairs holding the journals carefully in gloved hands, and another officer brought up the bottle of pills our parents had given us. I heard Mother's voice from the front yard getting loud and defensive, telling the officers this was all a misunderstanding, that their daughter Sophie had been having mental health problems. Father was agreeing, saying they'd been trying to get me psychiatric help. But then Eric showed up with a thick folder of papers and told the officers he had documentation going back 3 years showing Sophie's inconsistent behavior and academic performance. He'd been tracking every strange change, every personality shift, every unexplained absence, and he'd noted all of it because something had felt wrong for years. The social worker looked through Eric's documentation, and then at our journals, and then at Scarlett and me standing together. She told the officers this was the most serious case of child abuse she'd seen in 20 years of social work. The ambulance arrived and paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher. Scarlett tried to come with me, but the social worker said she needed to go to the hospital too for her head injury, so they put her in a second ambulance. As they wheeled me out, I saw our parents in handcuffs being put into separate police cars. Mother was crying and saying this was all a mistake, but Father just stared at the ground. At the emergency room, a doctor named Violet examined me, and her face got more and more angry as she documented my condition. She said I had a bleeding ulcer, severe malnutrition and dehydration so bad I needed immediate IV fluids. She asked how long I'd been sick, and I told her weeks, maybe months. But my parents wouldn't get me help because officially I didn't exist. Violet's hands clenched into fists, and she said she was filing a mandatory abuse report, and then she admitted me to the hospital with security posted outside my room. Scarlett was brought to the same hospital for her head injury, and they put her in a room down the hall. The social worker came to interview us again separately to make sure our stories still matched, and when they did, she looked at us both with tears in her eyes. She said she believed us, and she was going to make sure we were safe. Over the next few hours, more people came to talk to us. A detective named Dorian, who specialized in child abuse cases, asked detailed questions about our parents' finances. I told him about the insurance policy Scarlett had found, and he got a warrant to search the house for financial records. Later that night, he came back and said he'd found not just the insurance policies, but evidence of fraud going back years. Our parents had been collecting benefits for one disabled child, while hiding the existence of the second, double-dipping on tax credits, and planning to collect a death benefit while keeping the survivor as Sophie. The charges against them kept growing. child abuse, neglect, attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy. The detective said they were being held without bail because the judge considered them dangerous to us. That night, Scarlett was moved into my hospital room, and for the first time in 15 years, we slept in the same room legally. 2 beds, a window, no basement. I kept waking up to make sure she was really there, that this wasn't some dream I'd have to wake up from back in the basement. The hospital kept me for a week treating the ulcer and malnutrition. Scarlett stayed 2 even after her head healed because the social worker didn't have placement for us yet. We spent the days talking, really talking for the first time without having to whisper in the dark. We told each other stories about our separate months, filling in 15 years of gaps. I learned that during her March 3 years ago, she'd won a spelling bee, and she learned that during my October 2 years ago, I'd failed a math test because she'd been learning different material. We were 2 people who'd been forced to be one, and now we were learning who we actually were beyond the Sophie performance. Eric visited us and brought our journals. The police had copied them as evidence but released the originals back to us. He sat beside our beds and said he was sorry for not understanding sooner, for not seeing the pattern clearly enough to stop this years ago. Scarlett grabbed his hand and told him he saved our lives by documenting everything, and believing her when she finally told the truth. Eric started crying, and said he'd never seen anything like our case, that he'd been a counselor for 15 years, and he'd missed so many signs. I told him there was no way he could have known because our parents had designed the system to be invisible. He was the first adult who'd ever cried because of what happened to us, instead of what we cost them. On day 12 after our escape, the social worker Caroline found us a placement. She looked exhausted when she came to tell us, like she'd been fighting hard to find something good. She said a family 2 towns over named the Richardsons wanted to take us together. Max and his wife Elodie had fostered siblings before, and they understood that separating us would be another trauma. Caroline said our case was extraordinary even for her, and she'd seen terrible things in 20 years of social work. We moved into the Richardson home that afternoon. They gave us each our own bedroom, and I stood in mine staring at the bed and the dresser and the window with curtains. Scarlett came to my doorway, and we looked at each other, both of us holding our small bags of hospital clothes and donated items. That night, I tried to sleep in my own room, but I kept getting up to check that Scarlett was still in the house, still real, still alive. Around midnight, she appeared in my doorway and asked if she could sleep in my room. We pushed our beds together and lay there in the dark, not talking, just being in the same space. Elodie found us like that in the morning, and she didn't say anything about it, just asked what we wanted for breakfast. Over the next weeks, we kept ending up in the same room at night, not sure how to sleep without knowing where the other one was. Elodie never forced us to use separate rooms or act grateful or perform normalcy. She just let us figure out our own rhythm. Meanwhile, our parents' case moved forward fast because the evidence was overwhelming. The journals documented 15 years of systematic abuse. The insurance policies showed financial motivation. The fraud was clear in the financial records. Eric's documentation proved the school had noticed problems for years. Medical records showed Sophie's inconsistent health over 15 years, sometimes healthy and sometimes sick with no explanation. The prosecutor came to visit us at the Richardsons and said our parents were facing 20 to 30 years in prison. She asked if we wanted to give victim impact statements at sentencing, and we both said yes immediately. Scarlett said we needed to speak in the same room at the same time and have them see us both as real. 3 months after our escape, we stood together in court. I'd chosen a new name by then, Violet, after the doctor who saved my life. Scarlett kept her name because it was the one thing that had always been only hers. We walked into the courtroom holding hands, and I saw our parents sitting at the defense table. They looked smaller somehow, less powerful than they'd seemed our whole lives. The judge asked us to speak, and we took turns telling our story. I described what it was like to live as half a person, to spend every other month in a basement pretending I didn't exist. Scarlett described the fear of switching, of having to become someone else, of carrying 2 lives in one body. We talked about the journals and the midnight briefings where we taught each other how to be Sophie. We described the moment our parents gave us the pills and the 7-day deadline. Our parents stared at the floor the whole time, never looking up at us. When the judge sentenced them to 25 years each, Scarlett squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. We stood up together and walked out of the courtroom into the sunlight, 2 separate girls who finally got to exist at the same time.